Alright, so for this set of videos, we're going to go through Chapter 12, which is going to be on JavaFX. So we're going to be taking a look at the general concept of GUI programming, as well as talking a little bit about some of the basic controls that are available in JavaFX. In addition to these basic controls, we're also going to get into some of the containers that allow us to add controls to a graphical application, so to a GUI application. So to get started with this, we're going to first take a look at the distinction between effectively the kinds of programs that you've likely been writing up to this point, which are primarily using a console interface. So these are going to be dealing with what we would describe as command line interface applications or CLI applications. And then we're going to contrast that with what we're going to be working with now, which is going to be more GUI-based programs. So that's going to be with graphical user interfaces. So to take a look at this distinction, we are first going to consider a command line interface. So I've got a bit of an example right here of one. So there's going to be two different types. We're going to look at this command line interface. We'll then also take a look at the graphical user interface. With the command line interface, this is going to involve entering commands on some kind of terminal or command prompt window in order to perform tasks on your computer system. So everything is very text-based when you're dealing with a command line interface. One of the primary problems with this approach, why it is that we've transitioned to more commonly using graphical user interfaces, is because of the fact that it tends to be much more tedious and it's fairly difficult for most non-programmers or less, what I would say, tech-savvy individuals to be able to use. So to give you a quick example of this, I'm going to go ahead and minimize these PowerPoints. We're going to take a quick look at an example. Since I'm on a Windows machine, I'm going to use PowerShell as an example of this. So go ahead and open that up. So we'll open up this little interface right here so you can kind of see something that matches up with the diagram that I included. So we've essentially started right here. We're going to begin in my C drive. Particularly, we're in one of my user folders or user directories. If we wanted to, we could actually go ahead and take a look at the contents inside of it. So if you imagine this basically like trying to open up your file system, so you could see all the different folders and files in a certain location on your computer. We can go ahead and do that with one of two different commands. Since we're on PowerShell, we could do it using a command that's more commonly found on Windows, which would be dir, just short for directory. This will go ahead and display a list of all of the different files and folders at that location. Alternatively, we can also use another command, since PowerShell does offer a couple of different Linux-based commands. We can also do something like ls, which accomplishes the same thing. So taking a look at this, we've got the whole set of different folders and files at this location. I'm going to go ahead and use this opportunity to try to navigate to my desktop, since the desktop tends to be the most common aspect of a graphical user interface, at least when it comes to an operating system on your computer. So in order to do that, because I have this set up to be linked with more cloud-based storage, I'm going to have it stored on OneDrive in this case. So I'll need to go ahead and navigate to that folder, which you can see right here. To do that, I'm going to be using this cd command, essentially just short for change directory. We'll go ahead and move into that, and then if we take a look inside of here, we can see the desktop listed inside of there. So we'll go ahead and navigate to that using that cd command again. And then inside of that desktop, we can again take a look and go ahead and display some of the different files and folders that are at that location. So as you can see from this, just being able to navigate to a particular location on my computer system, a little bit more time consuming. If you're not terribly familiar with these commands, it's more tedious or more cumbersome to just move around to different locations. The other problem that we run into, as I mentioned, this is all going to be stored through OneDrive, so you don't immediately know necessarily how to get to the desktop doing it this way if you're not familiar with where to navigate to. So in that sense, you could also say that this approach in some ways can be less intuitive as well. The other problem, again adding to this this issue of the less intuitive nature, is that you'll notice a couple of folders and files right here. In a moment, I'll go ahead and show my actual desktop as an example of a GUI application. And you're going to notice that the couple of files and folders that I have right here, this doesn't actually display everything. So again, you don't necessarily know precisely where everything's going to be stored or located if you're doing it through a command line interface instead of with a GUI. So again, that can also kind of hinder that intuitive process with it. So coming back over here, go ahead and close this out. And we'll move into the other aspect of things. So eventually we transition to graphical user interfaces. These provide users with a more visual computer experience that provides highly intuitive and much easier to use controls. So as I mentioned, your desktop or just the general more visual file system that's provided with most modern day operating systems, that tends to be one of the most common examples of a GUI. Very easy to use compared to a command line interface, and very easy to navigate through as well. So if we go ahead and minimize this, I'll also go ahead and just get this out of the way. So we can also take a quick look at my desktop itself. So you can actually see all of the different icons that I have on my desktop. So you got your typical recycling bin, a couple of icons for different applications, primarily just applications related to either programming or being able to set up these videos, as well as that general projects folder. So the overall setup here, much more visually appealing, much easier to just kind of scan through this desktop and determine what applications I actually have available. Everything is actually presented right here. If I'm not really sure where to find something, I can also just open up the file system, and then I have this much more, again, much more visually appealing setup. It's much easier to understand precisely where everything is. Instead of having to deal with everything in terms of just text-based commands and displays, instead everything has an icon or some kind of what you could describe as visual metaphor for a particular location, like a folder or some files inside of that folder. That makes it much easier to understand what it is that you're looking at logically. So we'll go ahead and close that. Open this back up. And one of the other things to note about GUIs is that this has also led to a new way that we can interpret program execution. So up until now, the primary approaches that you've dealt with, if you're doing mostly things in a console window with maybe some set of user requests, followed up with some user inputs, and then some processing with those user inputs. So you're primarily dealing with sequential and decision structures. So you mostly are doing a lot of your work in the main method, maybe with a couple of additional methods included. And you're pretty much just going from top to bottom through that main method of your program. So the flow of your program is primarily moving from top to bottom through some set of tasks, so some sequence of lines of codes that you'll go through. But there's also a third approach, which is what is known as event-driven execution. Through GUI-based applications, this event-driven execution is now possible as well. So rather than having some set order, so say like top to bottom, now your programs can actually execute lines of code from various locations as needed. So general idea about this is, say for example with a typical GUI application, you're probably going to open up a window of some kind that will consist of, say maybe with a form, it's going to have a couple of labels telling you what everything means. You might have some text fields where you're going to type in some input, and then some buttons you'll click to perform some kind of action. And part of that code requires actually opening up that window so that it's actually displaying and visible to you. Other parts of that code deal with executing some functions when you click those buttons or type in those text fields. And in order to execute that code that comes with that, the program needs to be able to shift control to different locations within your overall program. So that's where that idea of event-driven execution comes from. Okay, so getting into the next set of, or the next couple of videos after this, we're going to go ahead and start taking a look at some actual coding. We'll start off by looking at a particular class that's going to be essential for writing GUI applications, as well as also taking a look at some of the fundamental aspects of being able to set up your first GUI application. So we're going to take a look at that through the JavaFX libraries that are provided in Java.